New York in the 1930s is a restless city, alive, electric, and dangerous. Smoke curls through jazz clubs and tenement alleys, the sound of trumpets blending with the distant wail of police sirens. The streets are slick with ambition, deals are made in whispers, blood spills quietly, and power is traded like currency. Beneath the glittering lights of Times Square, a silent war rages. Every neighborhood has its king, every block its enforcer. The city may seem alive, but it is fractured, each gang clawing for survival in a jungle built of greed and fear. Out of this chaos emerges a man whose name will become synonymous with both order and corruption, Charles Lucky Luciano. He does not roar like the others. He watches, calculates, and moves when the moment is right. His genius is not born from books or privilege but from pain, poverty, and an instinct to survive. In a world that worships violence, Luciano's weapon is structure. He sees what others do not, that crime, like business, can be organized. That bloodshed can be replaced with boardrooms, and bullets with handshakes. Before Luciano, the Mafia was chaos, a storm of old traditions clashing with the new world. Immigrant gangs fought not only for territory but for identity, dragged between Sicilian codes and American temptations. Luciano, still young, looks at this disorder and envisions something revolutionary. To him, the streets are not a battleground but an untapped market. Every speakeasy, every union, every corrupt official, potential pieces of a machine that could run smoother than any corporation on Wall Street. He walks through Mulberry Street with confidence that borders on arrogance, his tailored suit a declaration of evolution. He understands power as a performance, how to charm, how to threaten, how to make men believe that following him is the only path to survival. To the public, he is just another face in a city of hustlers. To those in the shadows, he is something new, a man who can turn chaos into order. Yet behind his calm exterior lies a mind haunted by its own ambition. Luciano knows that every system he builds will demand sacrifice. Every alliance will carry betrayal within it. Every empire will one day crumble. But for now, in this moment, New York belongs to no one, and he intends to change that. The prologue closes as dawn breaks over Manhattan. Streetlights flicker out, the city exhales, and Luciano stands at the window of a rented room overlooking the skyline. Somewhere below, deals are being made and bodies disposed of. But in his mind, he sees a different future, a syndicate united not by tradition, but by profit. A new world is being born, and he will be its architect. The air of Lower Manhattan at the turn of the century is thick with the smell of coal smoke, sweat, and desperation. The streets are alive but suffocating, a maze of overcrowded tenements filled with immigrants who traded one kind of poverty for another. Pushcarts line Mulberry Street, selling stale bread and bruised fruit. Children run barefoot over cobblestones slick with rain and refuse. It's a world built on survival, where dreams are crushed under the weight of rent collectors and rival gangs. Here, the American dream is not golden, it's grimy, bloody, and cruel. In these slums, Italian immigrants huddle together for protection, creating small islands of the old world and the new. They speak in dialects that outsiders can't understand, keeping to themselves out of fear and mistrust. The prejudice from real Americans is open and merciless. Italians are branded as criminals, unfit for the promises of the new world. That label becomes prophecy. Out of necessity, they form their own economies, their own laws, and eventually, their own underworld. What begins as survival, a neighborhood defense against exploitation, slowly mutates into organized crime. Protection rackets. Smuggling. Gambling. Vice disguised as honor. The gangs that control the streets, the 5 Points Gang, the Eastman Gang, the Hudson Dusters, become unofficial rulers of the immigrant districts. They are the law and the punishment. The police are corrupt or indifferent, the government far removed from the misery of the slums. Every neighborhood becomes its own fiefdom, run by young men who answer only to power. Blood spills as easily as beer in a backroom speakeasy. Violence becomes the only language that guarantees respect. For young Salvatore Lucania, the boy who would become Lucky Luciano, this is the classroom where he learns about life. Born in Sicily and raised among the filth and hunger of New York's Lower East Side, he grows up watching power being earned not through kindness or education, but through fear. The older boys who collect protection money are his role models. They walk with swagger, wear sharp clothes, and command respect from men twice their age. Luciano sees them not as criminals, but as kings in a world that crowns no one else. He learns early that rules are written by those who can enforce them. In the tenement hallways, he witnesses mothers begging landlords for mercy while their sons are dragged into gang fights on the street. He learns that survival requires both charm and cruelty. His first hustle isn't grand, carrying packages, running errands, taking small cuts from petty deals. But beneath his quiet demeanor grows a restless intelligence. He watches, absorbs, and calculates. Outside his window, the sounds of the city never stop, horses clopping, men shouting, glass breaking. The night hides more business than the day. This is a city of opportunity, but it rewards only those who dare to take it. Luciano's eyes are drawn to the saloons and gambling dens, where the real deals happen, where crooked politicians shake hands with mobsters, and fortunes are decided with a signature or a bullet. In these streets, fear is a constant companion. Irish gangs, Jewish mobs, and Italian factions wage silent wars for control. Every corner, every alley, has an owner. One wrong glance can end your life. But there's also a strange kind of beauty in it, a raw, unfiltered energy. For Luciano, this chaos is not a warning, it's an invitation. He begins to understand that power doesn't come from brute force alone. It comes from control of men, money, and minds. The early 1900s are cruel to the poor, but they are generous to the cunning. The Prohibition era is still a whisper on the horizon, but already, vice is thriving under the noses of the authorities. The city's moral guardians preach temperance while secretly drinking bootleg whiskey. Luciano sees hypocrisy everywhere, from priests who bless gangsters to politicians who dine with murderers. The line between criminal and citizen blurs with every passing day. And in this moral fog, a boy named Lucky begins to see the blueprint of his future. The poverty around him is no longer a curse but a forge, hardening him into something sharper. The world before Luciano is chaotic, unorganized, and governed by emotion. There are too many bosses, too many wars, too much pride. He looks around and sees waste, wasted potential, wasted money, wasted lives. He doesn't yet know how, but he knows he will be the one to change it. As night falls over Mulberry Street, a young Luciano stands by a flickering lamppost, his eyes tracing the horizon where the city lights fade into darkness. To most, the view is just another reminder of how far they are from wealth and power. But to him, it is a promise. He sees not chaos, but opportunity, a kingdom waiting for a ruler who understands both the brutality of the streets and the elegance of control. The streets of New York are broken, divided, and dangerous. But to the boy who walks them with quiet confidence, they are also a map, one that, if read correctly, leads straight to power. Salvatore Lucania's transformation into Lucky Luciano did not happen in a single moment, it was the product of fire, blood, and instinct sharpened by hardship. Born in 1897 in Lercara Fritti, Sicily, Luciano's earliest memories are filled with hunger and hierarchy. Even as a child, he witnessed the Sicilian code of silence, omerta, being lived out in whispers and fear. Men disappeared, debts were paid in blood, and justice was handled in dark alleys, not courtrooms. When his family sailed across the Atlantic in 1906, the New World promised safety and prosperity. What they found instead was the Lower East Side, a jungle made of brick and smoke, where every nationality fought for survival. The Lucania family's apartment was cramped and airless, a single room shared by 6 people. His father, Antonio, worked long shifts as a sulfur miner turned laborer, too proud to admit defeat, too poor to rise above it. His mother, Rosalia, prayed for her children to find honest work, but Salvatore saw how honesty trapped men in misery. On the streets, the dishonest thrived. He noticed the swagger of gang leaders, their tailored suits, their easy smiles, the way fear followed them like a shadow. They were treated like kings, even the police looked away. That realization burned into him early: power protects itself. School never held his attention. He preferred the lessons of the street, where survival depended on quick thinking and faster decisions. By age 10, he was already running errands for small-time hoodlums, carrying packages, collecting bets, and learning the unwritten laws of the underworld. By 13, he was organizing his own street crew, charging local kids protection money to walk safely to school. It wasn't cruelty, it was business. And unlike others, Luciano treated it like one. He learned to calculate risk, to read expressions, to recognize weakness. Violence was never his first choice, it was inefficient, messy. Words, he discovered, could hurt more than knives. When a rival kid refused to pay, Luciano didn't beat him, he made him an example. A few coins went missing, and rumors spread that Luciano could make money appear or vanish at will. Reputation became his armor. Fear became his currency. The streets also introduced him to other rising figures, boys like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Lansky, a sharp-minded Jewish kid from Poland, fascinated him. Unlike most gangsters, Lansky wasn't ruled by ego or rage, he was ruled by logic. Together, they recognized that ethnic divisions were a weakness. While older Italians distrusted anyone who wasn't Sicilian, Luciano saw potential allies everywhere. He and Lansky began trading favors, learning from each other. It was the beginning of a partnership that would reshape American crime. But before the empire, there were scars, literal and psychological. The most defining came in 1929. Luciano, then already known as Charlie Lucky, was abducted, beaten, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach. His face was slashed, his body broken. The motive was unclear: revenge, betrayal, or perhaps a warning. Most men would have vanished after such a near-death experience. Luciano didn't. He emerged changed. His left eye drooped slightly from nerve damage, his grin now carried a permanent hint of menace. But more than that, he became colder, detached, a man who had stared death in the face and realized he could outlive it. It was this luck that cemented his legend. Newspapers whispered about the gangster who couldn't be killed. To Luciano, luck wasn't divine, it was calculation, the art of survival disguised as chance. Every decision he made afterward carried a kind of fatalistic clarity. He began dressing like a banker, speaking like a politician, and moving like a man who already owned half the city. The 1920s roared around him. Prohibition turned ordinary crooks into millionaires. While other mobsters saw quick cash, Luciano saw infrastructure. Speakeasies, brothels, smuggling routes, all could be organized, standardized, and taxed. He partnered with Masuria and later Maranzano, learning from them while secretly plotting beyond them. To Luciano, loyalty was transactional, not emotional. He admired power but never worshipped it. Every man was useful, until he wasn't. This was the age when his name began to echo in backrooms and newspapers. Lucky Luciano, the boy from Mulberry Street who moved through danger untouched. His charisma was magnetic. Even enemies admitted his presence could silence a room. Women admired him, politicians tolerated him, and criminals feared him. He became the embodiment of the new gangster, not the brash killer of the old world, but a calculating executive of crime. Yet beneath that composed surface lay a quiet philosophy. Luciano believed chaos was inevitable, but controllable. The world didn't need to be clean, it just needed to be managed. Every bribe, every alliance, every betrayal was part of a system. He was no longer just surviving, he was building. As he looked at the skyline of New York, those tall, glittering monuments of ambition, he saw a reflection of himself. The city was corrupt, restless, and ruthless, but it was also alive, driven by order hidden beneath its noise. He wanted to mirror that structure within the shadows. The boy Salvatore Lucania was gone. In his place stood Lucky Luciano, a man who would soon take the chaos of the underworld and mold it into something terrifyingly efficient, a criminal empire that would outlive him. And though he smiled often, the streets never left him. They lingered in his gait, in his tone, in the flicker of calculation behind his eyes. He was both the product of his environment and its master. Fate had spared him, but it was not mercy, it was an opportunity. And Lucky Luciano was not a man who wasted opportunities. By the early 1920s, America was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. The nation had survived a world war, danced through the Jazz Age, and plunged headfirst into one of the most defining experiments in moral control, prohibition. Overnight, alcohol transformed from a nightly ritual into a forbidden treasure. And in that vacuum of legality, crime found its greatest opportunity. Bars went silent, but backrooms came alive. For Lucky Luciano, this wasn't chaos, it was an open market. The country was thirsty, and he was ready to sell the cure. Luciano had already spent years studying men, gangsters, politicians, police officers, bootleggers, and even priests. He knew one truth better than anyone: every man has a price, and every system has a weakness. The old-world Sicilian dons didn't understand this new America. They clung to honor, pride, and blood feuds, ancient codes that kept them small, predictable, and divided. To Luciano, that kind of thinking was suicide. He wanted something new, a criminal order modeled not after monarchs, but after corporations. He started quietly. Working under Joe, the boss, Mafia, one of New York's most feared mob leaders, Luciano began building alliances outside traditional boundaries. He forged bonds with Jewish and Irish criminals, men like Meyer Lansky and Arnold Rothstein, who brought intellect, efficiency, and connections into the game. While others dismissed them as outsiders, Luciano saw a future where ethnicity didn't matter. Profit did. To him, a gun was just a tool, but a network, that was power. Rothstein, in particular, left an indelible mark on Luciano. Known as the Brain, Rothstein was a gambler and businessman who treated crime as a system. He didn't fight for territory, he negotiated for it. He bribed judges, owned politicians, and moved money with precision. Luciano studied him like a student studies scripture. It was Rothstein who taught him to think in terms of structure, flow, and sustainability. Why fight for a single street corner when you could control the city's supply chain? Why settle for respect when you could own obedience? Under Rothstein's influence, Luciano began seeing patterns: how corruption trickled upward, how fear could be replaced with loyalty through profit sharing. He learned that rules, even in crime, created stability. With prohibition in full swing, bootlegging was the gold rush of the underworld. But instead of simply smuggling liquor, Luciano designed a business model. He divided operations into clear departments: supply, distribution, enforcement, and political protection. He paid police captains as if they were shareholders, kept accountants to track shipments, and imposed discipline among his crews. To his men, it felt like evolution: crime was no longer about chaos, it was about control. He adopted the language of businessmen. He didn't speak of hits, but of removing liabilities. He didn't order extortion, but discussed collection systems. The language itself reshaped the psychology of his empire. His men began to think less like killers and more like executives, ambitious, loyal, and invested. Every successful job meant bonuses, every failure meant termination, often permanent. Luciano was redefining the underworld's DNA. But not everyone appreciated his vision. The old dons, men like Mafia and Maranzano, viewed Luciano's partnerships with non-Italians as betrayal. To them, the Mafia was sacred, an inheritance from Sicily meant to be protected by blood and tradition. Luciano saw that as weakness. He didn't want to serve ancient codes, he wanted to rule a modern machine. Yet, he played the part perfectly: respectful, obedient, quiet. Beneath the surface, however, his mind was always turning, always calculating. He knew that sooner or later, the old world would have to die for the new one to rise. By 1925, Luciano had become indispensable. His network spanned across New York, Chicago, and New Jersey. He controlled liquor shipments from Canada to the East Coast, with Lansky overseeing financial logistics and Siegel handling enforcement. They were young, ruthless, and forward-thinking, a new breed of gangsters who understood psychology as much as muscle. Luciano didn't need to yell or threaten, his calm confidence was more terrifying than any outburst. When he spoke, people listened, because behind his words was always a plan, and that plan always ended in profit. But success came with enemies. Masuria's paranoia grew as Luciano's influence expanded. The boss didn't like his underlings' growing independence, his fancy suits, or his alliances with Jews. Luciano smiled, played loyal, and waited. He had learned that timing was everything. You don't kill the king until you already were the crown in the minds of his subjects. Every handshake, every favor, every quiet conversation was a step toward that inevitability. In the meantime, he refined his empire's moral code. Violence was to be strategic, never emotional. Bribes were investments, not expenses. Information was the highest currency. And loyalty, not born from fear, but from shared prosperity, was sacred. This philosophy distinguished Luciano from every mob boss before him. He didn't just rule, he managed. He didn't demand respect, he engineered it. By 1929, the Luciano organization was operating with frightening efficiency. Smuggling routes were synchronized, political contacts secured, and rival operations either absorbed or eliminated. The underworld had never seen such precision. For the first time, the Mafia looked less like a network of thugs and more like an invisible government, one that taxed, regulated, and punished without any official authority. Luciano had taken the raw, violent energy of the streets and molded it into a system as organized as any Wall Street firm. And yet, he knew it was only the beginning. In his mind, America was the land of limitless markets, and crime was just another form of capitalism. He believed in scalability, expansion, franchising. If one city could be controlled, why not 10? If liquor could be monopolized, why not labor, gambling, narcotics? The old dons fought for neighborhoods. Luciano dreamed of nations. In smoky backrooms and hotel suites, he began whispering a new idea to his trusted allies, an idea so radical it would change the very structure of organized crime. A commission, a council, a board of directors for the Mafia, where disputes would be settled not with bullets, but with votes. It was the vision of a man who understood that power built on violence is temporary, but power built on order endures. He didn't know it yet, but this idea, born from the chaos of prohibition and the hunger of his youth, would become his masterpiece. Lucky Luciano was no longer a product of the streets. He was their architect, their economist, their silent god. The making of a visionary criminal was complete. The 1930s arrived drenched in tension and blood. The roaring chaos of prohibition had turned the underworld into a battlefield where alliances shifted overnight, and the line between friend and enemy blurred with every gunshot. For Lucky Luciano, the city had become a chessboard, and every player, gangster, cop, politician, was a piece waiting to be moved. But even a master strategist could not escape the old world's shadow. The Sicilian dons, men still enslaved to pride and superstition, were dragging the underworld into a full-scale civil war, the Castellamarese War, a conflict that would become Luciano's crucible. The war began as a struggle for dominance between two aging titans, Joe, the boss, Masuria, who ruled the New York Mafia like a feudal lord, and Salvatore Maranzano, a proud Sicilian traditionalist from Castellamare del Golfo. Their rivalry was more than a power dispute, it was a war of ideologies. Masuria represented the brash, street-born chaos of Americanized gangsters, Maranzano embodied the old-world hierarchy of honor, respect, and obedience. Both men were blind to the changing times, and both underestimated the quiet, charming man who served under them, Lucky Luciano. For years, Luciano had served Mafia faithfully, at least on the surface. He played the loyal lieutenant, attending meetings, running operations, collecting envelopes. But behind his polished smile, he was already dreaming of something greater. He knew that Mafia's arrogance and greed would destroy him. The boss demanded blind loyalty but offered no vision. He saw crime as a personal empire, not an organization. Luciano saw something larger, a system that could survive beyond any single man. The Castellamarese War turned New York into a city of funerals. Drive-by shootings became routine, bodies appeared in alleyways like clockwork, and the streets of Little Italy ran red. No one trusted anyone. Restaurants, barber shops, even churches became potential death traps. Luciano, moving between both camps, began to see opportunity in the bloodshed. He realized that both Mafia and Maranzano were fighting for a throne that would soon be meaningless. The future of organized crime, he believed, lay not in tradition, but in evolution. He began to play both sides carefully. To Mafia, he was still the faithful lieutenant. To Maranzano, he was the pragmatic negotiator. He fed each man just enough truth to keep suspicion at bay while quietly orchestrating the fall of both. It was dangerous, nearly suicidal, but Luciano thrived on risk. He understood that real power required not just muscle, but patience, the ability to let others destroy themselves while you quietly prepare the foundation for their replacement. By 1931, the city had reached its breaking point. The violence was out of control. The public demanded action, and law enforcement, pressured by headlines, began cracking down hard. For Luciano, this was the perfect storm. The more chaos consumed the old bosses, the easier it became to position himself as the voice of order. He began rallying younger mobsters from all ethnic backgrounds, Italians, Jews, Irish, whispering promises of a new structure where everyone could profit without endless bloodshed. It was a revolutionary idea in a world built on distrust. And then came the defining act, the day the old world died. On April 15, 1931, Joe Mafia invited Luciano to lunch at a small restaurant in Coney Island. It was a familiar scene, pasta, wine, cigars. They played cards as laughter echoed in the backroom. Then Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. Moments later, gunfire shattered the calm. When he returned, Mafia was slumped over the table, his cards still in hand, a half-finished glass of Chianti beside him. The hit was executed flawlessly, 4 men entered, fired, and vanished into history. Luciano, the loyal protégé, had arranged the death of his own boss. The newspapers called it betrayal. Luciano called it progress. To him, Mafia's death wasn't murder, it was removal of inefficiency. The old structure had to collapse for the new one to rise. With Mafia gone, Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. But Luciano had no intention of kneeling to another tyrant. He attended Maranzano's meetings, nodded respectfully, and quietly began plotting his second act of revolution. Maranzano wanted to shape the Mafia like the ancient Roman Empire, complete with hierarchies, tribunes, and provinces. To some, it sounded glorious. To Luciano, it sounded like delusion. He didn't want an empire built on ceremony, he wanted one built on logic. Within months, Luciano learned that Maranzano was secretly planning his assassination, fearing the young gangster's growing influence. It was a fatal miscalculation. Luciano struck first. In September 1931, a group of men posing as IRS agents entered Maranzano's office on Park Avenue. Moments later, the self-proclaimed boss of all bosses was dead, his body riddled with bullets and knife wounds. With his death, a century of Sicilian tradition ended. Luciano didn't just win a war, he ended an era. What emerged from that bloodshed was something entirely new, an underworld reborn under the laws of efficiency, diplomacy, and control. Luciano abolished the title of boss of bosses, replacing it with a commission, a governing body of equal power among the leading mafia families. It was democracy for criminals, a boardroom for outlaws. Disputes would now be resolved through meetings, not massacres. Profit would be shared, not stolen. And while it appeared egalitarian, everyone knew who truly held the strings, the man who had survived 2 masters and outsmarted them both. The Castellamarese War had baptized Luciano in betrayal and blood. But in that furnace, he had forged his greatest weapon, the understanding that loyalty is temporary, but structure is eternal. The war taught him that violence creates chaos, but organization creates power. And in a world where men killed for pride, Luciano had learned to kill for purpose. When the smoke finally cleared, New York was quiet again. The city, weary from years of gang warfare, began to breathe. Luciano stood at the center of it all, unchallenged, untouchable, and visionary. The Mafia was no longer an army of hot-headed killers. It was now a syndicate, efficient, disciplined, and frighteningly modern. In that moment, Lucky Luciano stopped being a gangster. He became an institution. The streets that had once raised him in violence now bowed to him in silence. He had turned murder into policy, chaos into order, and crime into business. The age of kings had ended, and the age of architects had begun. When the gunfire of the Castellamarese War faded, New York City entered a strange calm, not peace, but the kind of quiet that follows a storm when everyone is still counting the dead. For the first time in years, gangsters could walk the streets without constantly glancing over their shoulders. The old bosses were gone, their corpses buried with their archaic codes, and out of that blood-soaked soil rose something new. At the center of it stood Lucky Luciano, immaculate in his tailored suits, his cigarette dangling lazily, his expression calm but unreadable. The newspapers called him a criminal genius. His rivals called him a kingmaker. But Luciano called himself something else, a businessman. His first act of genius was understanding that absolute power was an illusion. The title Capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, had cursed the Mafia for decades. Every man who claimed it eventually died by betrayal or bullet. Luciano had no interest in repeating history. Instead, he introduced a structure that mirrored the American corporate system, a network of balance, regulation, and accountability. In 1931, he created the Commission, the most radical invention in the history of organized crime, a council that would rule the underworld not through fear, but through consensus. The Commission was his masterpiece, a shadow government disguised as cooperation. Its structure was elegant, efficient, and terrifyingly logical. It consisted of the heads of the 5 families of New York, Luciano's own family, later known as the Genovese, along with those led by Joe Prophesy, Vincent Mangano, Tommy Gagliano, and Joseph Bonanno. Outside New York, the council extended invitations to powerful mob bosses across America, Al Capone in Chicago, Frank Costello, and later, Stefano Megadino in Buffalo. Every major decision, from business expansions to assassinations, had to pass through this unseen boardroom of criminals. To the public, these men were respectable entrepreneurs and importers. To those in the know, they were the board of directors of America's dark economy. Their meetings were not held in back alleys or smoky bars, but in hotel suites and private clubs, where polished silver and silk napkins replaced guns and growls. The rules were simple: no wars without commission approval, no killings of fellow bosses without a vote, and no business that jeopardized the syndicate's overall stability. The days of chaos were over, order had taken its throne. Luciano's philosophy was brutally pragmatic. He knew that greed could destroy alliances faster than bullets. So he turned greed into policy. Every family could keep its profits, but they all had to respect shared territories and contribute to common causes. If disputes arose, they were mediated, not massacred. This simple structure transformed organized crime into an empire that operated with corporate precision. And at its core sat Lucky Luciano, not as a tyrant, but as a silent chairman, the man who held influence through intellect, not fear. But Luciano's brilliance wasn't only in organization. It was in optics, how he made evil look civilized. He didn't see himself as a mobster, he saw himself as an executive managing an underground economy. When he addressed other bosses, he used business terms, partners, territories, distribution networks. When he spoke to politicians and judges, he played the role of the generous donor, the man with friends in high places. Every handshake was an investment. Every smile, a negotiation. His power didn't rely on intimidation, it relied on his ability to make corruption feel respectable. Under the Commission's governance, crime in America became industrialized. The Mafia wasn't just controlling gambling or liquor anymore, it had its hands in labor unions, construction, entertainment, shipping, and even government contracts. Luciano saw it as a symbiotic relationship. The Mafia provided stability in the underworld, and in return, it demanded silence from the authorities. He bribed officials not just to look away, but to participate. Politicians who once condemned the Mafia now benefited from it. Judges who swore to uphold the law found themselves attending lavish dinners paid for by men they once swore to destroy. The power of the Commission extended far beyond New York. Through strategic partnerships, Luciano helped unify national syndicates. In Chicago, Al Capone's organization, the Outfit, coordinated with New York families to divide bootlegging profits. In Florida and Cuba, networks for gambling and narcotics distribution flourished. Luciano was turning crime into a franchise, a system that could be replicated, managed, and scaled. It wasn't just organization, it was globalization before the term even existed. Still, there was a dark genius behind his order. Luciano understood human nature, its hunger, its vanity, its inevitable weakness. He used that knowledge like a puppeteer. When two rivals within the Mafia began feuding, Luciano didn't intervene directly. He invited them to the table, offered wine, and reminded them that war costs money. If they continued to fight, both would lose their cut of profits. If they cooperated, they would both prosper. Slowly, greed became his greatest enforcer. Men killed for pride, Luciano made them live for profit. It was less bloody, more profitable, and infinitely more controllable. His version of the Mafia operated on a quiet paradox, a criminal empire built on order. It had laws, rules, taxes, and even punishments, all enforced without courts or juries. Betrayal was handled swiftly, but discreetly. Death was no longer spectacle, it was administration. Luciano despised unnecessary violence. Blood, he once said, is bad for business. His underworld was governed not by rage but by arithmetic, by balance sheets, votes, and silent agreements sealed with respect, not terror. Yet, this order came at a cost. The structure Luciano built depended on constant equilibrium, and equilibrium demanded control. Every decision, every alliance, every conflict had to be measured. It made the Mafia stable, but also rigid. And while Luciano believed he had built something eternal, he also knew that human ambition would always test its limits. Even as the Commission thrived, whispers of betrayal and envy never stopped. Rival bosses watched his every move, questioning whether his equal counsel was truly equal, or if they were merely living under a benevolent dictatorship. But in this brief golden age, Luciano's dream had come to life. For the first time, organized crime mirrored legitimate society. There were territories like states, leaders like governors, and laws like constitutions. The Mafia had evolved from chaos into a functioning shadow government, invisible, yet omnipresent. If the police were the face of law, then the Commission was its dark reflection, the mirror through which America's corruption stared back at itself. In private moments, Luciano would look out over Manhattan's skyline, the glowing towers of Wall Street, the rhythm of ships docking in the harbor, the hum of business pulsing through every street. He would smile, not from arrogance, but from satisfaction. He had done what no gangster before him had ever done, he had turned the underworld into an empire of structure and discipline. He had proved that crime, when organized, could become indistinguishable from power itself. The Commission was not just a criminal council, it was America's shadow government, run not by ballots or law, but by profit and fear. And as the city slept, unaware of the silent machinery operating beneath it, one man sat atop it all, calm, calculating, untouchable. Lucky Luciano had turned the chaos of his youth into the order of an empire. He hadn't just changed the Mafia, he had redefined the very meaning of power. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had achieved what no gangster before him ever dared to imagine: control without chaos, power without constant bloodshed. The old Mafia had been about pride, territory, and vengeance. Luciano's Mafia was about business. He had taken the raw savagery of the streets and refined it into an economic system, a network of profits that stretched across every corner of American life. To him, crime wasn't rebellion, it was capitalism without rules. And in a world where greed was the national language, Lucky Luciano had become its most fluent speaker. The United States was deep in the grip of Prohibition's unintended legacy. The alcohol bans that once sparked moral panic had now created an underground economy worth billions. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the government thought the mob's empire would collapse overnight. But Luciano had anticipated this. He knew that when one market closed, another would open. He pivoted effortlessly, transforming his bootlegging empire into a diversified portfolio of vice, gambling, narcotics, prostitution, and union control. His empire adapted faster than the law could keep up. Luciano's brilliance was his ability to see opportunity in immorality. While the public argued over ethics, he calculated profit margins. Gambling, for instance, wasn't just about rolling dice or flipping cards, it was about human psychology. The house always wins, he would say, but his house was the entire city. Through a vast network of bookies and underground casinos, he made sure every bet, from horse racing to card tables, flowed through Mafia hands. The profits were staggering, and more importantly, they were steady. Gambling became the Mafia's beating heart, constant, controlled, and endlessly renewable. Then there was the sex trade, a business that Luciano industrialized like a factory system. Before him, prostitution was disorganized, dangerous, and small-scale. Pimping was done by thugs, not strategists. Luciano changed that. He saw sex not as filth, but as commerce. He centralized brothels, standardized prices, ensured medical checks for workers, and even developed coded systems to avoid police raids. His brothels were discreet, elegant, and frighteningly efficient. Newspapers would later call him the Vice King, but to Luciano, it was simply supply and demand. People want what they want, he once remarked coolly. I just make sure they pay for it through me. The third pillar of his empire was labor control, a subtler, more dangerous game. The Mafia's infiltration of labor unions wasn't just extortion, it was leverage. By controlling dock workers, truck drivers, and longshoremen, Luciano could dictate the flow of goods through New York Harbor, the nation's most vital economic artery. Every crate, every shipment, every strike, all moved according to his will. He could halt commerce with a word, bankrupt rivals with a whisper, or flood the city with contraband overnight. It was no longer about street corners. It was about infrastructure. In a very real sense, Luciano didn't just own the streets, he owned the arteries of America itself. And behind all this organization stood his partnership with Meyer Lansky, the Jewish mastermind who became his equal in intellect, if not in fame. Lansky was the accountant of crime, the mathematician of vice. Together, they formed a balance of power unlike anything the underworld had ever seen: Luciano, the charming diplomat and strategist; Lansky, the quiet architect of finance. Lansky introduced him to offshore accounts, money laundering, and international investment. They moved profits from brothels and gambling dens through banks in Cuba, Panama, and Switzerland, transforming dirty money into legitimate capital. For the first time, organized crime had accountants, auditors, and international balance sheets. Their friendship was based on respect, not ethnicity, a rare thing in that era. Luciano once told Lansky, "We're not Italian or Jewish in this business. We're businessmen." That single sentence summarized the transformation of organized crime under his rule. He erased the tribal divisions that had kept the underworld fractured for decades and replaced them with an ideology of profit. The Mafia was no longer just a Sicilian brotherhood, it was a multinational corporation. But this sophistication came with a paradox. The more legitimate Luciano's operations appeared, the deeper his corruption spread. He wasn't just bribing low-level cops anymore, he was buying judges, city officials, even senators. His reach extended into City Hall and beyond. Construction contracts, union elections, waterfront licenses, all bore his invisible signature. Every handshake in New York, from the docks to the mayor's office, seemed to trace back to him. The Mafia was no longer at the margins of society, it was part of its machinery. And that was Luciano's greatest triumph, and his greatest sin. He understood the psychology of power better than any politician. While others fought for authority through titles or votes, he acquired it through dependency. People owed him favors, debts, secrets. And once someone owed Luciano, they were his forever. He didn't need to threaten or shout. A quiet phone call, a soft reminder, a polite smile, that was enough. Fear of his wrath was less powerful than fear of losing his protection. He made even honest men complicit. Luciano's empire thrived on paradoxes. He built order from crime, discipline from corruption, prosperity from vice. He moved like a ghost between worlds, respected in high society, feared in the underworld, admired even by law enforcement who couldn't help but see his brilliance. Yet beneath the calm surface, he was restless. He knew that his system, as perfect as it seemed, relied on delicate equilibrium. One misstep, one betrayal, could send it all crashing down. And betrayal was always close. Some of his own men began resenting his calm control. They missed the old ways, the blood, the chaos, the adrenaline. Others grew greedy, chafing under the commission's rules. And then there were the women, madams, mistresses, and informants, whose whispered words and pillow talk sometimes reached ears they shouldn't. Luciano trusted few, but even that wasn't always enough. By the late 1930s, cracks were forming beneath the polished surface of his empire. Politicians who once turned a blind eye were feeling the pressure of reform. The press had begun painting Luciano as the symbol of moral decay, the man who had turned America's vice into an industry. Reformers demanded justice, the police needed a trophy. The same system that had made him powerful was now attracting unwanted light. But for now, his power was unmatched. The Mafia, once a ragged collection of immigrants fighting over scraps, had become a vast, self-sustaining economy. From illegal betting slips in Harlem to elegant nightclubs in Miami, from prostitutes in Manhattan hotels to dockworkers in Jersey, everything moved according to Luciano's design. Even legitimate businessmen envied his efficiency. Wall Street had its stock market, Luciano had his network, both driven by the same principles of supply, demand, and control. And when Luciano stood at the center of it all, surveying his invisible empire, he felt a sense of godlike detachment. He had proven that chaos could be controlled, that even sin could be structured. He had taken the raw hunger of the streets and refined it into a silent economy that fed on human desire. To him, crime was no longer about rebellion or revenge. It was about understanding human weakness, and monetizing it. Yet deep down, he knew what all empire builders eventually learn: no system built on corruption lasts forever. The same greed that fuels growth also invites collapse. He had built the business of crime into a fortress of wealth and secrecy, but its foundations, loyalty, silence, and fear, were brittle. Somewhere, even now, someone was talking. Someone was breaking the code. Someone was watching. And though Luciano didn't yet know it, the empire he had crafted with such brilliance was about to face its reckoning. His own creation, the perfect system of organized crime, was about to turn against him. The machine he had built was flawless in design but fragile in humanity. It had made him untouchable, unstoppable, until the day it made him visible. By the dawn of the 1940s, Lucky Luciano stood at the height of his empire. He had built an invisible kingdom that spanned continents, a criminal civilization so efficient it operated like a second government. The police, the politicians, even Wall Street brokers, all played their roles inside his system, knowingly or not. His profits flowed through legitimate banks, his orders were delivered through whispers, and his name was spoken with a mix of awe and fear. He had achieved what no mobster before him had, legitimacy in everything but law. Yet, in the shadows of his triumph, the machinery of justice was beginning to move against him, quietly, methodically, and with a vengeance born not from morality, but from politics. The first real threat came from Thomas E. Dewey, a young, ambitious prosecutor whose star was rapidly rising in New York's political world. Dewey wasn't like the others who could be bought or intimidated. He saw the underworld not as a mystery, but as a cancer, and Luciano was its beating heart. Dewey understood something few lawmen did: to destroy a system that thrived on fear and silence, you had to attack it through exposure. He wasn't chasing killers, he was chasing the accountant, the brothel manager, the courier, the woman forced into silence. Dewey's crusade wasn't against violence, it was against control. Luciano's empire, for all its sophistication, had one fatal weakness: its reliance on human desire. His prostitution network, spread across New York and beyond, was so vast that it touched every social class. From dockworkers to diplomats, from lowly drifters to city elites, everyone was a customer. Luciano treated it as business, but for Dewey, it was the perfect target. It was tangible, traceable, and morally sensational. In a society eager to prove its virtue during the Depression years, the idea of a man turning sex into an industry was the ultimate outrage. The investigation began quietly, almost invisibly. Police raids on brothels became more frequent, not to arrest the women, but to make them talk. At first, no one did. Omerta held strong, even among those not formally part of the Mafia. But Dewey's office adapted. They offered deals, protection, and in rare cases, vengeance. They painted Luciano not as a businessman, but as a monster. One name after another, the chain began to form. Small-time madams and prostitutes who had once whispered his name with respect began to whisper it in fear. And in those whispers, Dewey found his weapon. In 1936, Dewey struck. One morning, newspapers blazed with headlines: Lucky Luciano indicted for compulsory prostitution. The charge sounded almost absurd: America's most powerful gangster brought down not for murder or extortion, but for running brothels. But it was genius. Dewey wasn't just after Luciano's body, he was after his myth. The untouchable gangster had finally been touched. Within hours, federal agents and police swarmed New York, raiding clubs, hotels, and private apartments. Every woman even loosely connected to the vice trade was interrogated. Dozens broke down under pressure, some naming Luciano directly. The image of the elegant Don who ran the city with grace and intellect began to crumble. When they finally arrested him, Luciano was in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, the same hotel where millionaires and politicians dined, often on his dime. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He was led out in handcuffs, impeccably dressed, his face calm, his smirk unbroken. To the crowd outside, he was still the man who had turned chaos into order. But to the law, he was now the most dangerous man in America. The case moved quickly. Dewey's evidence was circumstantial, built largely on testimonies of frightened women and second-hand accounts. But his strategy was psychological, not legal. He flooded the media with stories of Luciano's cruelty, his manipulation, his empire of sin. Each newspaper headline chipped away at his image of sophistication, replacing it with that of a sadistic overlord who profited from human degradation. The same charisma that had made him untouchable now worked against him: he was too famous, too polished, too perfect a villain. Luciano's lawyers fought hard, arguing that the charges were fabrications, that the witnesses were coerced. But Dewey had momentum, and in the court of public opinion, momentum was victory. The trial became theater, a clash between modern law and organized crime, morality and greed, America and its own reflection. Reporters packed the courtroom, sketch artists captured every smirk, every cigarette flick. Luciano, for his part, played the role of calm defiance. He smiled at his accusers, complimented the judge, even joked with reporters. But behind his cool demeanor, he understood what was happening. He wasn't just on trial for vice, he was on trial for his idea of power. For years, Luciano had believed that his structure, the commission, the code, the order he imposed on chaos, made him immune. But now he realized the cruel truth: systems can't protect you when the world needs a villain. Dewey needed a name to build his political career, the public needed redemption, and the Mafia needed a scapegoat. Luciano was all three. As the evidence piled up, the betrayal began. Men who once swore eternal loyalty turned informant. Corrupt officials who had taken his bribes suddenly remembered their oaths. The web of silence he had built so carefully began to unravel thread by thread. Even Meyer Lansky, his closest ally, could do little. The press frenzy had turned the case into a spectacle. Luciano was no longer fighting the government, he was fighting an idea, that he represented everything America feared about itself: ambition without conscience, wealth without morality, success without legitimacy. The day the verdict came, the courtroom was suffocating with anticipation. The jury found him guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence: 30 to 50 years in prison. Gasps filled the room. Luciano barely moved. He straightened his tie, nodded slightly, and whispered something to his lawyer: "It's only business." Outside, reporters hailed Dewey as a national hero. The man who had brought down the untouchable gangster. Crowds gathered on the courthouse steps, chanting his name. But among the underworld, there was silence. No one dared speak against the decision. The commission met in secret, officially accepting the verdict as law. Luciano's empire didn't crumble overnight, it adapted, led by his chosen successors. But the myth of invincibility was gone. In his cell at Dannemora, the walls were cold and gray, but Luciano's mind was restless. He wasn't defeated, he was re-evaluating. The empire still existed, the money still flowed, and the loyalty, for now, held firm. But for the first time since his rise, he felt the weight of his own system pressing down on him. The order he had built to protect himself had also made him visible, predictable, and vulnerable. Luciano would spend his nights pacing, cigarette glowing in the dark, replaying every decision, every handshake, every alliance, every betrayal. Somewhere along the way, the architect of order had become its prisoner. His empire had grown too perfect, too disciplined, too reliant on its founder. And now that founder sat behind bars, watching the machine he created move on without him. The fall of Lucky Luciano didn't come with a bang, it came with paperwork, press conferences, and public applause. He wasn't brought down by bullets or rivals, but by the very society he had mirrored too well. He had learned how to play by America's rules: capitalism, structure, influence, but he had forgotten one thing: America loves success, but it hates those who hold a mirror to its corruption. And so, the man who once ruled New York from the shadows now sat in the shadows of a cell, contemplating the irony of his own empire. The king of order had been consumed by the very system he built. But deep inside, Lucky Luciano knew, kings don't die easily. They simply adapt. And his story, though bent, was far from over. The summer of 1936 in New York was hot, restless, and electric. The Great Depression was easing its grip, jazz filled the streets again, and America was hungry for spectacle. It found one in the courtroom of People v. Charles Lucky Luciano, a case that became not just a trial of a man, but of an entire era. The newspapers called it the trial of the century. The people called it justice. But to Luciano, sitting behind the defense table in his immaculate pinstripe suit, it was theater, and he knew every actor's part, even his own. From the moment the trial began, the press devoured it like a feast. The image of the underworld's invisible monarch, now caged in the glare of public judgment, was irresistible. Photographers jostled for position each morning as Luciano arrived, flanked by deputies. Reporters described him as serene, smiling, unshaken. They wrote about his shoes, his cologne, his charm. Even in disgrace, he radiated control. But behind that calm exterior, his mind was sharpening every word, every look. He understood that a trial wasn't just about evidence, it was about narrative. And in narrative, perception was power. Thomas E. Dewey, the young, razor-sharp prosecutor, knew it too. He had built his entire career on one idea, that America needed to believe in the possibility of moral cleansing. His target wasn't just Luciano, it was the idea of organized crime, the notion that corruption could live comfortably inside modern society. Dewey stood before the court and painted Luciano as the embodiment of that sickness, a man who had taken the sins of the city, sex, gambling, violence, and turned them into an empire of profit. He is not merely a criminal, Dewey thundered. He is the criminal mind of our age. The evidence itself was fragile, a spider's web of testimonies from prostitutes, madams, and frightened underlings, many of whom had been coerced or promised protection. But Dewey's genius wasn't in the evidence, it was in presentation. He transformed the trial into a morality play. Each witness became a confession, each question a sermon. Dewey's courtroom tone carried both righteousness and theater. He would pause dramatically, lean toward the jury, and ask, who profits from sin if not the man who made sin a business? The witnesses, nervous, trembling, some in tears, told stories that fed the public's imagination. They spoke of collections, codes, payoffs, and threats. They described a system so vast and efficient that it blurred the line between crime and enterprise. Some said they'd never met Luciano directly, but it didn't matter. The narrative was too good. To the jury, to the nation, he had become the symbol of the corruption they feared and secretly envied. Luciano's defense team tried to dismantle Dewey's case piece by piece. They argued that the witnesses were unreliable, that there was no physical proof linking Luciano to the prostitution network. They emphasized his role as a legitimate businessman, pointing to his investments, his charitable donations, his impeccable public composure. But they were fighting more than facts, they were fighting a wave. The moral tide of the 1930s demanded redemption. America wanted to believe that good could triumph over the underworld that had seduced it during Prohibition. Dewey gave them that story. Luciano became the villain the country needed to hate. In court, Luciano never raised his voice. When Dewey accused him of being the director of a vast criminal syndicate, Luciano only smiled. When witnesses broke down under cross-examination, he leaned back and whispered to his attorney, "They're acting better than I expected." His calm infuriated Dewey, who mistook it for arrogance. In truth, it was strategy. Luciano understood that outrage made men sloppy. If he appeared unbothered, he could control the room, even as a prisoner. But there were cracks. One afternoon, during testimony from a key witness, a madam named Cokie Flo Brown, Luciano's mask nearly slipped. Flo, trembling under oath, described how she and other women paid tribute to Luciano's men weekly, how his name was spoken like law in the red light districts. She looked at him once while testifying, just once, and the courtroom held its breath. Luciano's jaw tightened, just barely. That tiny flicker of emotion made headlines the next morning, "The king of crime finally flinches." It was a lie, but perception was truth, and Dewey knew how to weaponize both. Outside the courtroom, the world moved on, but America's fascination deepened. Newspapers sold out by the millions. Radio shows discussed the trial every night. To the public, Luciano was no longer human, he was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the promise of the American dream. He was the immigrant success story turned nightmare, a man who had used ambition, intelligence, and charm not to build, but to corrupt. Ironically, the same traits that once made him admired now made him hated. The verdict, when it came, was almost inevitable. On June 18, 1936, after days of deliberation, the jury returned, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to phone their editors, and Dewey, his face flushed with victory, allowed himself a small smile. The sentence was swift and severe, 30 to 50 years in state prison. The longest sentence ever handed down for a vice-related case. Luciano listened without expression. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply adjusted his cufflinks and replied, "Let's get it over with." To the press, his composure was chilling. To his men, it was a signal, the empire still stood. He left the courtroom as he had entered it, impeccably dressed, head high, surrounded by flashbulbs. The public saw humiliation, his followers saw defiance. But as the cell door closed behind him at Clinton Correctional Facility, known as Dannemora, a different kind of silence set in. For the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano was no longer free to move his own pieces on the board. Behind prison walls, he reflected on the irony of it all. He had outwitted mobsters, lawmen, and even death itself, but he couldn't outmaneuver the theater of morality. Dewey hadn't beaten him with evidence, he'd beaten him with the story of America's need for redemption. Luciano had always believed he could manipulate perception, charm the powerful, intimidate the weak, control the narrative. But now he realized he had been part of a larger play all along. Still, he refused to see himself as a victim. "I built something," he once told a guard quietly, "and they can't destroy it just by locking me up." And in a way, he was right. His arrest hadn't dismantled the Mafia, it had legitimized it. The commission continued to operate, now under the careful management of Frank Costello and others. Luciano had created a system so efficient that it no longer needed its creator. From his cell, he watched reports of ongoing rackets, profits, and expansions. The empire lived, faceless, relentless, organized. Meanwhile, Dewey's star rose like wildfire. He became the city's hero, the embodiment of justice in a corrupt world. But even he knew, deep down, that his victory was symbolic. He had imprisoned a man, not an idea. The underworld's machine still hummed beneath the surface, its gears turning in silence. Luciano's absence had not stopped it, it had made it mythic. The man behind bars was now a legend. And that was the paradox of Lucky Luciano's fall, the courtroom had destroyed his freedom but immortalized his name. In trying to erase him, America had written him into its mythology. His photograph, that cool smile, that perfect suit, that aura of unbreakable composure, became the face of organized crime itself. In the silence of his prison cell, he would light a cigarette, inhale deeply, and stare at the wall as if it were a chessboard. He had lost a battle, yes. But in the long game of power, control, and legacy, he still saw moves ahead. He was still Lucky Luciano. And as long as his creation survived, so did he. The trial had ended his era as a free man, but it had also marked his transformation into something larger, a legend, a symbol, a cautionary tale. The court thought it had punished a criminal. In truth, it had canonized a king. The cold stone walls of Clinton Correctional Facility loomed like a fortress carved out of despair. Situated in the remote reaches of upstate New York, surrounded by snow, mountains, and silence, the prison was nicknamed Little Siberia. For most inmates, it was a place where hope went to die. But for Charles, Lucky Luciano, it became something else entirely, a throne room without windows. Even behind bars, his influence refused to fade. The man who once ruled New York's underworld from smoky boardrooms now began to rebuild his empire from a concrete cell. When Luciano arrived at Dannemora in 1936, the guards treated him like any other prisoner, stripped, deloused, and assigned a number, 92168. The tabloids painted his new life as poetic justice, the mighty Don reduced to washing dishes and scrubbing floors. But that illusion didn't last long. Within weeks, he began to shape the prison around him the same way he had shaped the streets. Luciano understood that every institution, even a prison, ran on hierarchy. There were guards to be bribed, inmates to be organized, and routines to be bent. By the end of his first year, he had established a quiet dominance over the population. He never raised his voice, never made threats. He didn't need to. Cigarettes, coffee, protection, he distributed them strategically, the same way he once distributed rackets. Guards soon discovered that the notorious gangster was a model inmate, polite, well-dressed, cooperative. But that politeness came with a price. Luciano began trading favors, offering guards money through outside contacts, securing privileges for other inmates in exchange for silence and loyalty. Within months, he controlled the prison's internal black market. If someone wanted contraband, better food, or a message smuggled out, they went through Luciano. From his cell, letters began to flow, coded, subtle, and precise. Using intermediaries and corrupt officials, Luciano maintained communication with his associates on the outside, particularly Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Vito Genovese. The commission was still active, and though Luciano was officially absent from its meetings, his influence guided every major decision. His words were treated like orders, his suggestions like commandments. Even in confinement, his reach extended from New York to Chicago, Havana to Los Angeles. The newspapers might have declared him finished, but the underworld knew better. Luciano wasn't dead, he was merely operating from a new headquarters. Prison also gave him time to think, something he had rarely done in his years of constant movement. He began to reflect on power, loyalty, and the machinery he had built. He knew now that structure alone wasn't invincible. The system worked, yes, but it required constant adaptation. The outside world was changing, prohibition was over, law enforcement was modernizing, and new criminal opportunities were emerging in gambling, narcotics, and international trade. From his cell, Luciano started to plan the next evolution, not just for his empire, but for himself. He started reading books on business, psychology, even military strategy. Fellow inmates would see him sitting on his bunk for hours, silently turning pages, cigarette smoke curling above his head. He studied corporate models, fascinated by how companies decentralized authority while maintaining control. He compared that to the commission structure and saw both its strengths and its flaws. Power, he once told a guard, isn't about where you sit. It's about who still listens when you speak. And people were still listening. By 1942, America was at war. The world outside was consumed by uncertainty, and even the government was forced to look into the darkest corners for help. The war transformed Luciano's imprisonment into an opportunity. Rumors began circulating that the U.S. Navy, desperate to protect its ports from Axis spies and saboteurs, was reaching out to the underworld for assistance. The docks of New York, vital to the war effort, were riddled with Mafia influence. Strikes, theft, and suspected espionage made the Navy nervous. If anyone could restore order there, it was the man who once ruled the waterfront. Enter Operation Underworld, a secret wartime collaboration between U.S. naval intelligence and the Mafia. Through intermediaries, the government made contact with Meyer Lansky, who acted as the bridge between the underworld and the authorities. Lansky convinced officials that Luciano, despite being imprisoned, could help. And so, from his cell in Dannemora, the unthinkable happened. The U.S. government struck a deal with Lucky Luciano. In exchange for ensuring that no strikes, sabotage, or foreign agents interfered with New York's ports, Luciano was promised leniency in his sentence. It was a transaction straight out of his playbook, business cloaked as patriotism. Luciano mobilized his network from behind bars, using his connections within the dockworkers' unions and the local mafia families to enforce discipline on the waterfront. Within weeks, the chaos subsided. The docks ran smoothly, efficiently, patriotically. It was as if the war effort itself now ran on mafia order. The irony was exquisite. The man branded as America's greatest criminal was now quietly serving its national security. The newspapers never learned the truth, the deal was buried deep in classified files. But within prison walls, Luciano's legend grew. Guards whispered about the inmate who had saved the Navy. Inmates watched him walk the yard with quiet awe. The government might have locked him away, but even Washington had to bend to his power. In 1945, with the war over and the docks secure, pressure began to mount for his release. Officials couldn't publicly admit their cooperation, but they couldn't deny the results. Behind closed doors, discussions began between prosecutors and politicians. Governor Thomas Dewey, the same man who had once built his fame by sending Luciano to prison, now faced the question of whether to free him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Dewey's ambition had always been tied to public morality, and freeing the man he once called the most dangerous criminal alive risked political suicide. But Luciano had done his part, and America needed to honor its debts, even the secret ones. In 1946, after nearly a decade behind bars, Dewey commuted Luciano's sentence on the condition that he be deported back to Italy. Officially, the reason given was services rendered to the war effort. Unofficially, it was acknowledgement, an understanding that even in chains, Luciano remained indispensable. When the decision was made public, America's newspapers erupted in outrage. "Lucky Luciano wins freedom," the headlines screamed. Moralists called it an insult to justice. But within the underworld, it was seen as divine symmetry. The man who had built a system too sophisticated to destroy had once again proven untouchable. The morning of his release was cold and gray. Luciano dressed in his best, a perfectly tailored three-piece suit, polished shoes, and his signature calm smile. Reporters shouted questions as he walked past, but he ignored them. He had survived betrayal, conviction, and incarceration. He had made a deal with the government itself. Now, he was stepping into exile, a king without a kingdom, but a king nonetheless. Before leaving, he paused for one last look at the prison gates. For nearly 10 years, those iron bars had contained his body, but never his mind. Dannemora had failed to break him, it had refined him. He had entered as a gangster. He left as a strategist, a philosopher of power, a man who understood that even walls can be turned into weapons if you know how to use them. As the transport ship prepared to take him back to Italy, Luciano stood on the deck and watched the shoreline of America fade into mist. Somewhere beneath that skyline were the streets he had ruled, the city he had built, and the system that still bore his fingerprints. The world believed he was finished. Luciano knew better. Empires don't die when their rulers fall, they adapt. And as the ocean wind whipped through his hair, he smiled faintly, the same half-smile that had unnerved prosecutors and presidents alike. He was free again, and for Lucky Luciano, freedom, no matter how conditional, always meant one thing: the game was about to begin anew. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship in Naples in 1946, exile felt like a quiet execution. America had discarded him, but the world still whispered his name. Italy was broken after the war, poverty, corruption, and hunger everywhere, and Luciano saw what others missed: opportunity. He was banned from the United States, yet his empire still pulsed beneath its streets. The commission lived on, and his word, though distant, still carried weight. At first, he played the role of the retired gentleman: press interviews, cafe visits, polished manners, but ambition never sleeps. He saw potential in Cuba, where Meyer Lansky was building casinos and luxury hotels under Batista's rule. In 1946, Luciano slipped into Havana under false papers. For a brief moment, he ruled again. The Havana Conference gathered America's top mobsters under his gaze, a meeting that crowned him the elder statesman of organized crime. Then Washington intervened. Pressured by U.S. authorities, Cuba deported him within weeks. Back in Italy, Luciano faced the slow death of irrelevance. He still advised, mediated, and mentored young Sicilian bosses, but age and illness crept in. He often stared at the sea and muttered, "I gave them order, but they only remember the chaos." In 1962, waiting at Naples airport to meet a film producer, he lit a cigarette, smiled faintly, and fell dead of a heart attack. He was 64. The man who had ruled empires of vice died quietly on a sidewalk. His body was flown home to New York, the city that had made and destroyed him, a final homecoming for the king in exile. Luciano's death closed a chapter but began a myth. His structure, the Commission, outlived him, governing the 5 families for decades. Before Luciano, crime was tribal; after Luciano, it was corporate. He turned gangs into governments, killers into executives, chaos into commerce. His blueprints shaped not only the Mafia but every organized system that followed. Through the 1950s and 60s, his influence spread like shadow law. The Mafia ruled labor unions, Las Vegas casinos, shipping docks, and politics. Even when prosecutors struck, they could never erase his design. "We can't stop crime," he'd once said. "We can only organize it." Those words became prophecy. But his greatest triumph carried its curse. The order he built outlasted its discipline. Later bosses sought fame, not structure, John Gotti replacing diplomacy with flash. The machine became loud, reckless, and traceable. The commission trials of the 1980s destroyed what remained, using Luciano's own hierarchy as evidence. The architecture that made him immortal also made the Mafia mortal. Yet his shadow remained everywhere, in films, in business culture, in the language of power. The refined villain, the honorable criminal, the man who mixes logic with sin, all born from his image. He was not merely a gangster, he was the blueprint of ambition stripped of morality. Luciano proved that success, when detached from conscience, becomes a kind of religion. His system turned corruption into structure, order into addiction. History called him a criminal, time made him a teacher. In the end, Lucky Luciano became both myth and mirror. His rise from the slums of Manhattan to the summit of the underworld wasn't just a crime saga, it was the American dream in reverse. He sought order in chaos and found that order itself breeds new corruption. From exile, he watched younger bosses turn his discipline into vanity. The code of silence he'd built through fear was eroding under greed. Yet even as his empire fractured, his philosophy endured: power survives through organization. He understood that the world, from politics to business, runs on the same currency as crime, fear, loyalty, and profit. Luciano's genius was moral clarity inside moral darkness. He never pretended to be good, he simply understood how good men could be bought. He saw the world not as just or unjust, but as transactional. "I didn't invent crime," he once said. "I just made it run smoother." His story ends not with redemption, but revelation. He showed that civilization's machinery, laws, corporations, governments, differs from the Mafia only in language. Beneath every empire lies the same hunger for control. As his coffin was lowered in Queens, it wasn't merely a gangster being buried, but an era. The man who tamed chaos with structure left behind a truth that still unnerves the world: order and corruption are not opposites, they are partners. Lucky Luciano died without forgiveness, yet with immortality. His name endures as both a warning and a testament, proof that in the dance between power and morality, it is always order that wins, even when born from sin.